Many things that I learned from Coach Wooden that had nothing to do with sports. Coach Wooden really made us. It's something you don't understand that your profession means that much to you until you have to find a new one. And it's like,
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar once admitted his relationship with Bill Walton was a Cold War. Shaquille O'Neal said he wanted to punch him in the face. Larry Johnson told him to trace his ancestry and count the slaves. Bill Walton was celebrated as one of basketball's purest talents, but to some of the NBA's greatest black players, he represented something far more complicated: privilege, judgment, and a system that always seemed to protect him while dismissing them. When Bill Walton arrived in Portland in 1974, he walked into a franchise that already had a star. Sidney Wicks was a four-time All-Star, a former Rookie of the Year, and a UCLA alumnus, just like Walton. Wicks had carried the Trailblazers through their struggling early years, averaging over 24 points and 11 rebounds. He was the franchise. But the moment Walton was drafted first overall, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, Wicks wasn't the savior, he was the problem. The clash between Wicks and Walton wasn't just about basketball, it was about philosophy. Wicks played isolation basketball, using his athleticism and power to dominate one-on-one. It was a style born of necessity on a bad team, predicated on physical dominance and individual scoring. Walton played the UCLA way: constant motion, selfless passing, team-first defense. To Walton, Wicks was irredeemably selfish. He believed Wicks cared more about his own statistics than winning. He viewed Wicks's style as an affront to the purity of the game, his dominance as empty calories that didn't translate to victories. But from Wicks's perspective, Walton was the unproven rookie who couldn't stay healthy. In his first two seasons, Walton missed significant time due to injury. Wicks was still carrying the load for a team that was supposedly built around a center who couldn't stay on the floor. Wicks had earned his place through years of struggle. He was the proven veteran, the all-star who had carried the franchise through its lean years. Walton was known as Captain Flake for his counterculture lifestyle, vegetarian diet, and lumberjack attire. Yet somehow the organization was siding with the eccentric newcomer over the established star. Portland's management made their decision clear. In 1976, they traded Sidney Wicks to the Boston Celtics. They replaced him with Morris Lucas, a tough enforcing power forward willing to protect Walton and do the dirty work. The results were immediate. In the very first season without Wicks, a healthy Walton led the Blazers to the NBA championship. The narrative was cemented. Wicks was the cancer. Walton was the cure. Wicks had been cast as the villain in Portland's creation myth, his individual brilliance dismissed as selfishness in contrast to Walton's pure game. For Wicks, this outcome was devastating. He had to watch the team he helped build win a title the moment he left, with all the credit going to the man who had criticized his character. The bitterness wasn't just about being traded, it was about being erased. Wicks's years of carrying a struggling franchise were rewritten as the obstacle that prevented success. His individual brilliance was dismissed as empty statistics that held the team back. Meanwhile, Walton was validated as the savior who brought championship glory through selflessness. The racial coding in this conflict was impossible to ignore. Black stars of the 70s were often labeled selfish for playing isolation basketball, while white stars who played team ball were praised as fundamentally sound. If the tension with Wicks was about style and displacement, the rivalry with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was about the throne itself. Kareem had established the UCLA dynasty under John Wooden. Walton followed, maintaining the Bruins' dominance. When Walton entered the NBA, the media immediately positioned him as the challenger, the only player with the size, skill, and intellect to dethrone Kareem. Kareem later admitted that during their playing days, their relationship was prickly. They were fierce rivals. For years, Kareem had ruled the NBA without a true peer. Walton represented the first legitimate threat, a player who could pass, defend, and rebound at a level that rivaled Kareem's own. The tension was fueled by perception. Kareem felt the media constructed a feud to heighten the drama of the white challenger versus the black king. The apex of their rivalry came during the 1977 Western Conference Finals. Walton's Blazers faced Kareem's Los Angeles Lakers. Portland swept the series 4-0. The defining moment was Bill Walton dunking over Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in Game 3. It was more than 2 points. It was symbolic conquest. The media seized on the image as proof that the torch had been passed from the established king to the young challenger. But Kareem resented the narrative. He scored over 40 points in one game and over 50 in another during that series. He later said he scored 50-something points, and everybody thought it was because he didn't like Bill, but it had nothing to do with it. They were trying to win the game. Kareem felt the media reduced his competitive intensity to personal hatred, when in reality he was just a professional trying to beat his opponent. opponent. The hatred in this relationship was largely a product of competitive claustrophobia. The NBA of the 70s wasn't big enough for two centers of such magnitude, particularly two who shared the same alma mater and the same cerebral approach to the game. Walton's style was boisterous, emotional, media-friendly. Kareem's was stoic, aloof, often misunderstood. Walton's victory in 1977 validated his claim, but his subsequent injuries robbed the league of a decade-long rivalry. In later years, they reconciled. But during that window in the late 70s, the friction was real. When Bill Walton signed with the San Diego Clippers in 1979, the conflict shifted from rivalry to economics. Walton signed a massive contract with his hometown team, with incentives that could push it to $1.3 million if the team reached the finals. But it wasn't the money that raised eyebrows. It was the non-monetary clauses. Walton demanded what became known as the Springsteen Clause. He refused to sign until the Clippers secured him 56 tickets to 7 sold-out Bruce Springsteen concerts, 8 tickets per show for himself and his friends. At a time when tickets were scalping for $200, this demand represented entitlement that was alien to most NBA players. The clause became legendary in league circles, a symbol of how different the rules were for certain stars. If you're shocked by what you've heard so far, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which feud surprised you most. We're just getting started. While Walton was securing concert tickets, his teammates were struggling in chaos. The Clippers were a franchise in disarray. Checks were bouncing, facilities were poor, the team was losing. Leading the charge was Lloyd World B. Free, a dynamic, high-scoring guard who prided himself on availability and effort. For Free and his teammates, seeing Walton receive superstar treatment while playing only 14 games in his first 3 seasons due to chronic foot injuries was profoundly frustrating. The disparity was staggering. Free was grinding through pain every single night, while Walton collected checks from the sideline. Coach Don Chaney later admitted that hatred developed in the locker room toward Walton. Despite rarely practicing or playing, Walton would reportedly yell at and embarrass teammates during the few times he was on the court, criticizing their fundamentals and effort. For World B. Free, who was carrying the offensive burden night after night on bad ankles and bad arenas, Walton's behavior was intolerable. Walton represented the aristocracy of the NBA, protected by his reputation, paid regardless of production. Free represented the proletariat, the players who had to produce to get paid. Walton later described his time in San Diego as his greatest failure and a stain on his soul. But for the players in that locker room, the hatred was a rational response to a system that rewarded a fragile past over a grinding present. They watched a man who couldn't contribute receive treatment they could only dream of, while they showed up every night to lose for an owner who didn't pay them on time. The resentment was about more than basketball. It was about respect, equity, and the fundamental unfairness of a system that protected certain players while exploiting others. The conflict with Larry Johnson during the 1999 NBA Finals marked a shift to the charged politics of race and language. Johnson, the emotional leader of the New York Knicks, made a controversial statement to the media. Describing the relationship between Knicks players and the league establishment, Johnson used the analogy of rebellious slaves. Johnson had converted to Islam and become increasingly vocal about social justice. He argued that despite his wealth, he could not rise above the mass conditions of his people. He pointed to the destruction of his childhood neighborhood by drugs and incarceration as evidence the system was not righteous. Bill Walton, broadcasting the series for NBC, reacted with visceral outrage. He declared on air that Johnson was a disgrace to the human race for invoking the horrors of slavery in the context of professional sports. Walton's reaction was rooted in his self-image as a progressive humanist. A disciple of John Wooden and a protester of the Vietnam War, Walton viewed slavery as a singular historical atrocity. To him, comparing NBA millionaires to chattel slaves was intellectually dishonest and offensive. Larry Johnson did not apologize. Instead, he fired back with a retort that cut to the core of Walton's identity. Johnson stated, "Tell him to trace his history and see how many slaves his ancestors had." By shifting focus from his own analogy to Walton's ancestry, Johnson highlighted the racial power dynamics at play. He was arguing that Walton, as a white man of privilege, lacked moral standing to police how a black man used the language of oppression. Johnson's response suggested that Walton's outrage was a form of white fragility, a refusal to acknowledge that the structures of ownership and control in the NBA bore a historical lineage to the plantation economy, regardless of the salaries involved. This feud remains a potent example of the white liberal versus black radical divide. Walton believed in the system's capacity for good. Johnson believed the system was inherently exploitative. Walton hated the rhetoric. Johnson hated the policing of his voice. Neither man backed down, and the conflict exposed a fundamental disconnect in how they understood power, history, and the black experience in America. It was a clash that transcended basketball and touched on deeper questions of who gets to define oppression and who has the authority to speak on it. The conflict with Shaquille O'Neal serves as a case study in the big man pecking order. Throughout the early 2000s, Walton frequently targeted O'Neal on broadcasts, criticizing his conditioning, his weight, and what Walton perceived as lack of effort. Walton stated that Shaq's arrogance was an insult to people who think. For O'Neal, these criticisms were personal. He admitted Walton's constant harping made him so mad he wanted to put hands on him. The tension escalated to the point where O'Neal publicly stated, "Next time I see Bill Walton, I'll punch him in his face." O'Neal's defense was what he called the big man pecking order code. Ordinance 2257. This ordinance posits that a player can only be criticized by someone with a superior resume. O'Neal acknowledged the authority of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Bill Russell. However, O'Neal argued Walton had broken the code. In Shaq's view, Walton's resume, hampered by injuries and limited to 2 championships and 1 MVP, was not quite good enough to speak on what I have done. O'Neal attacked Walton's credibility by citing his 6,000-plus career points. To O'Neal, longevity mattered. He viewed Walton as a temp who had a few great years. The most cutting aspect was the accusation of hypocrisy. Walton criticized O'Neal for being injured on company time. O'Neal found this rich coming from the poster child for NBA fragility. "If I'm faking an injury, his whole injury-plagued career is a fake," O'Neal argued. "Here's a guy who only played 1 or 2 seasons injury-free, and now he's talking about me being injured." Eventually, the two reconciled, with O'Neal accepting that Walton's criticism was tough love. The final antagonism involves Scottie Pippen and the greatest of all-time debate. After the Last Dance documentary, Pippen began distancing himself from Michael Jordan. Pippen made comments suggesting LeBron James might be the greatest player of all time. Pippen argued that while Jordan was a great scorer, LeBron's versatility and statistics made him the greatest player to ever play the game. Bill Walton, a staunch traditionalist, took Pippen's comments as a personal affront. Walton described Pippen's comments as shockingly ungrateful and stated those comments are as insulting as Pippen's moody disposition. Walton's use of moody disposition was an ad hominem attack designed to delegitimize Pippen's opinion by attributing it to emotional instability. To Walton, the Jordan era represented perfection. Pippen, by attempting to elevate LeBron over Jordan, was committing sacrilege. Walton's hatred of this take was a defense of the hierarchy he held dear. He viewed Pippen as a lieutenant trying to rewrite the history of the general who made him famous. Walton positioned himself as a gatekeeper, protecting basketball's traditions from modern debates. These antagonisms paint a portrait of Bill Walton as a mirror reflecting the tensions of his times. To Sidney Wicks, Walton was the usurper, the white savior whose arrival displaced the black star. To Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he was the rival who threatened the throne. To World Be Free, he was the symbol of inequity, the broken superstar who got concert tickets while the team suffered. To Larry Johnson, he was the oppressor, the white liberal policing the language of black pain. To Shaquille O'Neal, he was the hypocrite, the fragile giant daring to lecture the dominant one. To Scottie Pippen, he was the gatekeeper refusing to allow history to be rewritten. In each instance, the hatred was rarely about Bill Walton, the man. It was about what Bill Walton represented: privilege, narrative, hierarchy, and the often unexamined power dynamics of the NBA. Walton's brilliance made him unique, but it was his intersection with these black legends that truly illuminated the fault lines of the sport. He was celebrated for his selflessness, while others were criticized for their individualism. He was protected by the system even when he couldn't contribute, while others were labeled problems for demanding fairness. He was given the platform to judge, even when his own career was defined by what could have been. Drop a comment and let us know, was Bill Walton misunderstood or did he deserve the backlash? And who do you think had the strongest case against him? If you made it this far, hit that subscribe button.